On November 25, 2012, China's aircraft carrier Liaoning was anchored in the Bohai Sea for what was supposed to be a triumphant moment. A Shenyang J-15 fighter had just completed the country's first successful carrier landing, the culmination of years of work and billions of dollars in investment. Officers were celebrating on deck, cameras were rolling, and for a brief window, it looked like everything had come together. In the middle of that celebration, a 51-year-old man named Luo Yang collapsed from a heart attack. He died before the day was over. Luo had spent 15 years as the general manager of Shenyang Aircraft Corporation, overseeing the J-15 program from concept to carrier deck. He'd been working brutal hours for weeks leading up to the landing, and his heart simply gave out. He wasn't the first person to die in China's pursuit of aerospace self-sufficiency. He wouldn't be the last. This is the story that Western analysts tend to skip past. We hear a lot about China's rising military power, the satellite photos, the Pentagon reports, the new carriers and stealth fighters. But underneath that story is another one: what it actually cost to get here. The decades of failure, the tens of billions of dollars, the engineers who worked themselves into early graves. And here's why it matters beyond China. In 1986, the same year Beijing launched its indigenous jet engine program, India launched one too. Same ambition, same starting point, same year. 4 decades later, China powers its J-20 stealth fighter with a fully indigenous engine. India is negotiating to buy more French Rafales. That gap isn't about talent or resources. It's about something harder to measure and harder to replicate. To understand how China got here, you have to go back to 1960 and a rupture that shaped everything that followed. In the 1950s, China and the Soviet Union were allies. Moscow sent thousands of engineers and advisors to help Beijing build an industrial base from scratch. They shared blueprints. They trained Chinese technicians. They even helped design China's first jet engines. Then, in July 1960, it all stopped. The Sino-Soviet split turned allies into enemies almost overnight. Moscow recalled its advisors, more than 1,400 of them, and took the blueprints with them. Chinese engineers arrived at work one morning to find half-finished engines and empty filing cabinets. What followed was 2 decades of improvisation. China tried to reverse engineer what the Soviets had left behind. They copied the Klimov engines, the Tumansky designs, anything they could get their hands on. And for a while, it seemed to work. The engines ran, the planes flew. But there was a problem, one that wouldn't become obvious until much later. Reverse engineering can get you to about 80% of the original. You can copy the shapes, you can match the dimensions, but you can't copy the metallurgy that took decades to develop. You can't copy the manufacturing tolerances that come from institutional knowledge. You can't copy what the engineers knew but never wrote down. China's copied engines looked right. They just didn't last. The originals could run for thousands of hours before overhaul. The Chinese copies? Sometimes 30, sometimes less. Pilots learned to distrust them. The Air Force learned to work around them. And here's the trap. The more you rely on copies, the harder it becomes to develop originals. Your engineers spend their time matching dimensions instead of understanding principles. Your factories optimize for replication instead of innovation. You build an entire system around catching up. and catching up becomes all you know how to do. By the 1980s, China had been copying Soviet engines for 20 years. They could produce them reliably, but they still couldn't design one from scratch. The dependency had just shifted from relying on Soviet advisors to relying on Soviet designs. And that's when Beijing finally understood there are no shortcuts to a jet engine. In 1986, Beijing made a decision that would take 33 years to pay off. They approved the WS-10, China's first attempt at a fully indigenous high-performance jet engine. Not a copy, not a modification, an original design built from scratch with Chinese hands and Chinese knowledge. The program was a disaster from the start. The first prototypes failed basic tests. Turbine blades cracked, combustion chambers warped, the engines ran hot, ran rough, and ran for about 30 hours before needing a complete overhaul. The People's Liberation Army Air Force took one look at the results and rejected them outright. This wasn't bureaucratic caution. The PLAAF had pilots to protect. They'd seen what happened when engines failed at altitude. They'd buried colleagues who trusted equipment that wasn't ready. And the WS-10 wasn't ready. Not even close. What followed was 2 decades of grinding, incremental progress. Engineers lived at the test facilities. They ran engines until they failed, studied the wreckage, made adjustments, and ran them again. Thousands of tests, thousands of failures, each one a data point in a long march toward reliability. The human cost was real. In 2004, test pilot Ding Sang-si died when his engine failed during a routine flight. In 2016, Zhang Chao was killed during carrier landing trials, a reminder that the quest for self-sufficiency was still claiming lives. These weren't abstract statistics. These were men with families who believed in what they were building. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was almost invisible. Single crystal turbine blades. It sounds technical because it is. These are the components that sit in the hottest part of the engine, spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute while surrounded by superheated gas. They can't have any internal weaknesses, any microscopic cracks or grain boundaries where stress can concentrate. Soviet blades had them. American blades had them. For decades, Chinese blades didn't. Learning to manufacture single crystal superalloys took years of failed attempts. Furnaces that couldn't hold precise temperatures, molds that introduced impurities, crystal structures that grew in the wrong direction. When Chinese engineers finally mastered the process, it didn't make headlines, but it changed everything. Engine life went from dozens of hours to hundreds, then thousands. The PLAAF started accepting WS-10s for frontline squadrons. And in 2019, 33 years after the program began, the J-10C flew with a fully indigenous Chinese engine. No Russian parts, no Western components. Just Chinese engineering. And 3 decades of refusing to quit. The turning point came in March 1996. And it had nothing to do with engineering. China was conducting missile tests in the Taiwan Strait, a show of force meant to intimidate Taipei during its first democratic presidential election. Beijing expected the world to watch and take note. Instead, the United States sent 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the strait. The USS Nimitz and the USS Independence sailed within range of the Chinese mainland. And Beijing could do nothing about it. Nothing. China's navy couldn't challenge them. China's air force couldn't reach them. The missiles that were supposed to project power suddenly looked like fireworks compared to American carriers launching aircraft at will. For the Chinese leadership, it was a humiliation that cut deep. They had spent decades building a military, and in the moment that mattered, it was useless against American technology. What happened next was a bet, the biggest bet in Chinese military history. Beijing decided that aerospace self-sufficiency wasn't just a goal anymore. It was a national survival imperative, and they were willing to spend whatever it took. The numbers are staggering. Over the next 3 decades, China would pour more than $42 billion into jet engine development. Not aircraft, not missiles, just engines. They funded 4 major programs simultaneously. The WS-10 for fourth-generation fighters, the WS-15 for the J-20 stealth fighter, the WS-19 for smaller aircraft, the WS-20 for heavy transport planes. Each one a massive undertaking, all running in parallel. In 2016, they went further. Beijing consolidated the entire jet engine industry into a single state-owned enterprise, the Aero Engine Corporation of China. 96,000 employees, $7.5 billion in registered capital. One mission: end foreign dependency. It was the kind of centralized, long-term investment that only a one-party state can sustain. No elections to worry about. No shareholders demanding quarterly returns. No opposition party questioning why engines matter more than hospitals. Just a 30-year plan and the resources to execute it. By 2023, the bet was paying off. The WS-15, China's fifth-generation engine designed for the J-20, entered mass production. Not prototypes, not limited runs, full-scale manufacturing. It had taken nearly 4 decades, hundreds of billions of yuan, countless careers spent in test facilities. But China finally had what it set out to build in 1986, an engine that was truly its own. So what made the difference? Remember that comparison from the beginning? In 1986, China and India both launched indigenous jet engine programs. Same year, same ambition, similar starting points. 4 decades later, the gap is staggering. China's WS-15 powers the J-20 stealth fighter. India's Kaveri program was officially delinked from the Tejas fighter in 2014. After 28 years and over $2 billion spent. Because it never worked reliably. Today, India negotiates to buy more French Rafales, while China exports its own fighters to Pakistan. The difference wasn't talent. Indian engineers are among the best in the world. It wasn't resources. India had money to spend. The difference was commitment. The willingness to fail for decades without changing course. To bury engineers who died trying. To watch pilots crash and keep going. To spend $42 billion on something that might never work. And then spend more. Democracies struggle with this. Not because democracy is weak, but because it's responsive. Voters want results. Opposition parties ask questions. Budgets get reviewed. And jet engines don't care about election cycles. China didn't have those constraints. What it had was a 30-year plan and leaders who would never face the voters. That's not an argument for autocracy. It's an observation about what certain kinds of projects require and what they cost. Which brings us back to the Liaoning. Back to November 25th, 2012. Back to a man named Luo Yang. He spent 15 years running the J15 program. He saw the failures. He buried colleagues. He pushed through anyway. And on the day his work finally succeeded, his heart gave out. The official story calls him a martyr to Chinese aerospace. Maybe that's true. Maybe he was also just a man who worked too hard for too long on something he believed in. Either way, he wasn't alone. The WS-10 took thousands of engineers decades to perfect. Some of them didn't live to see it fly. That's the part of the story that doesn't fit in a Pentagon report or a satellite photo. The human weight behind the hardware. China has indigenous jet engines now. It paid for them in ways that can't be measured in yuan. And that might be the real lesson. Not that China succeeded, but what success actually required. 33 years, $42 billion, and lives spent in windowless factories, chasing something most of the world said couldn't be done.